Hello, and welcome to the ECR Retail Loss Sell More and Lose Less podcast series. My name is Colin Peacock. I work with a community of experts and academics who are keen to share their latest research findings and best practices. And every week or two in this series, I'll be joined by one of those experts and academics to discuss some of the very latest insights from our meetings and discussions and research on best practices. This week's podcast will look at store facial recognition use cases. I'm joined by Professor Adrian Beck, who has very kindly joined us even though his boiler has broken down. Thank you, Adrian. I hope you're not too cold up there in Leicestershire.
Yeah, I've got me furry slippers on at the moment, mate.
Oh, excellent. Well, look, we had a great session last week on our favourite subject we've been covering now for at least 6 years, facial recognition and the sort of the whole use case in retail around the sort of watch list. You know, all the other way and aggregating cases using facial recognition to tie together all the different offences. So we had 60 people on the call. We had lots of retailers, mainly retailers, and we had law enforcement and some lawyers and obviously academics. So what were your sort of, notes, if you like, and sort of new things that you heard versus previous years?
Yes, it's an ongoing topic, isn't it? And it's one of those areas where we've watched retailers mature in their thinking around this. If we go back 3 or 4 years, a lot of nervousness about, organizational reputation associated with those using facial recognition. We struggled to find any retailer who was prepared to go on record to say they were using it, didn't we? And so we've seen over time it's beginning to sort of become more established in some countries. And so we heard from a couple of retailers in this country who were openly, and quite freely, describing their experience. So it was really good to hear people now on the ground using it and beginning to feedback, how it works and the ways in which they're using it, and a sense of whether they think there's value in this. And the message from them was pretty positive, wasn't it? They felt it was making a real contribution to trying to deal with, this obviously growing concern we got in this country and others of the amount of external crime that's going on, and particularly, those more determined regular thieves who retailers really want to try and get out of their stores. And so their story was one of success. Yeah. And that so it's very interesting to hear now how it's becoming a little bit more established and people are prepared to accept that it could be part of their strategy in trying to deal with this external theft issue.
Yeah, it did seem as though there was a shift in it's a sort of slightly different approach that I heard, which is they were using a shared database as opposed to it was their own database. Did you sort of see that as new and different, or it seemed to enable a bit more privacy lawyers, or sort of the lawyers at these two companies, to feel better about it, that there was a database?
Yeah, I think there was a bit of a mixed opinion about this. There are those who are saying, we need to use a broader database so that if somebody offends down the high street, they can't just come up the high street and offend in my store. So I want this shared database of offenders, of people on the prohibited list, as it were. And I can see why people would want to do that, because people do, move around, and these persistent offenders will simply go from one retailer to another. But I think we heard others who were a little bit more cautious about that, a bit more concerned about, well, how do you ensure, the validity of who's going onto these lists? You're then relying on a third party to make sure that they have good processes in place to make sure they're not putting, as it were, the wrong people on it. But also this issue of proportionality came up, didn't it? Which is, if you have somebody who, let's say they've stolen a bar of chocolate in your store, do you then want them to go on a list where they're banned from every single store in the country? That's one of the dangers, of course, is when you have these combined lists, is that you can become, you don't get the proportionality right. You end up, really becoming quite draconian in the way that these are used. And certainly some retailers aired that concern, didn't they? That they had to make sure that if they were going to use these shared lists, that that they were happy and their businesses were happy, that the quality of the information going into it was sufficient to make sure that they were happy to use that shared information. But certainly, some were saying what an advantage it was, because certainly some of these organised gangs they were talking about that would move around the country, then it didn't make sense just to only have, your list, but actually understand how other people were being, impacted by these groups as well.
We heard from other countries as well, and I think you came up with some sort of football analogy around the use of facial recognition across the world.
Yeah.
Do you want to share your little?
Well, it may only make sense to people in the UK, Colin, but there seems like sort of different leagues of willingness to use this technology. In the UK, you've got the Premier League, those who are really advancing, and really that looks like China and the UK in particular, the ones who are moving forward with enthusiasm from certainly from the authorities. The British police are very keen on facial recognition, and increasingly a number of retailers coming out openly and say we're now using it. And then you go to sort of the next division down, the championship, as it were, which are countries who are, sort of stepping forward slowly, thinking about it, still wrapped up a little bit around the privacy issues, like Australia, where it's currently on hold because it's been reviewed by the data commissioner. And in the US, where it's a very patchy picture in some states, some retailers being banned from using it because of the way that they're doing it. And also like Canada, where, again, they're gently moving forward, cautiously, one might argue. And then you've got these sort of the lower division, the non-league, as it were, basically the rest of Europe, Scandinavia, where, it's just very problematic to be using this sort of technology. We know that there are, huge limitations on sharing video footage anyway. And so at the moment, they're really saying it would be highly problematic for us to be using this sort of technology in our stores as things stand.
Yeah. Well, look, it was a great session. It was really great to hear, as you say, that it does feel as though slowly, at least in the UK, we're inching forwards, and the rest of the countries as per your divisions. Yeah, I think that was any other notes you've got down, or was that? Yeah,
I think one other thing, Colin, I pick up on is, we need a bit of clarity and a bit of consistency and rigor and robustness in trying to understand what impact these technology are having. A lot of the people on the call would say it works, it's successful. But actually, when we began to look at some of the key performance indicators, it was less clear how they were measuring its impact. They're very keen to say, yeah, it's making a huge difference. So I think we need to make sure that we're getting some robustness in how we're saying, well, how is it working? And what are the measures of success for these sorts of technologies? People talked often about, well, our measure of success is the accuracy. Well, that's really a measure of its performance, not a measure of its impact. And so I think we need greater clarity across the industry about how we're measuring whether these things are having an impact or not. And I think as we go forward, hopefully that will happen.
Yeah, no, I was really confident that would happen. Because the rollouts of these companies were quite significant, 200, 300, 400 stores. So hopefully there'll be some stores with and some stores without, and so you'll get some real understanding of any impact on sales, which didn't seem to be coming up as a particular concern, but also impact in terms of financial performance on levels of losses. So yeah, that was a good final point. Well, look, we're anniversarying this again in 2025. Can you believe it? It'll be around before you know it, but. I think it's the 15th of January in 2025. But thank you very much for your notes, Adrian. Much appreciated. And we'll see you next time. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Well, that's all we have time for this week. Thank you for joining us. And thanks to all the ECR Retail Loss community for the sharing of their knowledge, their research and latest learnings that ensure that we become truly a global platform for learning. My name is Colin Peacock. This is the Sell More and Lose Less podcast. And if you liked it, please subscribe so you automatically get all future episodes. And also, if you think your colleagues and friends might also like it, please ask them to follow ECR Retail Loss on LinkedIn and tune in to our next podcasts. If you didn't like it, then let us know and we'll try and fix it. Either way, see you next time. Thank you again.